The ballroom was dressed in quiet grandeur, its chandeliers spilling warm light across the polished floor, where conversations hummed in soft waves, the kind of evening that suggested composure, but under the surface something else lingered, something tense, almost brittle. People mingled glasses, clinked polite laughter, scattered in the air. Yet a subtle undercurrent carried through the room. Near the entrance, reporters leaned into hushed discussions, their eyes darting toward the main stage where political heavyweights were set to appear. Everyone knew this wasn't just another gathering. It was a theater of power, and the audience was already waiting for the first act to unfold at the far end of the hall. Hillary Clinton made her entrance surrounded by staff and a wall of security detail that seemed to move as one. She carried herself with practiced ease. Her smile measured her eyes, sharp, scanning the room with the assurance of someone who had walked through countless political storms to many. Her presence was commanding, almost magnetic to others. It carried a weight that pressed down on the air itself. The crowd shifted, people leaning in closer, conversations stalling as she moved past. And it became instantly clear that her arrival had redefined the energy of the room in a quieter corner. Tulsi Gabbard stood with a small circle of supporters, her posture calm but steady, her expression thoughtful, as if measuring the unfolding scene. She was not one to crowd the spotlight unnecessarily. Yet, her presence carried a gravity of its own, something quieter, something rooted. Her eyes followed the flow of people, the pull of attention, the way power seemed to concentrate. Wherever Clinton stepped, it was as if she was watching not just the surface but the deeper currents beneath the evening. For a moment, the two women existed in parallel, each commanding attention in very different ways. Clinton with her soned authority and sharp edges, Gabbard with a calmness that felt almost disarming in contrast. The atmosphere rippled with that unspoken tension, a sense that eventually the parallel lines would converge, and when they did, the room would not remain the same. Guests moved between them, some drifting toward Clinton, eager for acknowledgement, others toward Gabbard, curious for perspective. But the split itself told a story. It was more than a social divide. It was a reflection of two approaches to politics, two visions of leadership, two ways of standing in the storm. And though no words had yet passed between them, the silence itself seemed charged, as though everyone was holding their breath. For what might follow, Clinton's staff whispered to security, brief exchanges that most wouldn't notice. But to those paying attention, the signals were clear. She wanted control of the environment, control of the moment. Meanwhile, Gabbard remained composed, her hands loosely folded, her voice low as she spoke with her group, not demanding the room's attention, but not shrinking from it either. The quiet strength of her presence was in sharp contrast to the practiced choreography of Clinton's arrival. The chandeliers flickered slightly as the air conditioning clicked on a small reminder that even in the most carefully staged environments, something unexpected could cut through. And as the night pressed forward, that quiet possibility, that hint of conflict began to take form. The stage was being set, and though neither Clinton nor Gabbard had yet made a move, everyone could sense it. The evening would not pass quietly, and the story that would unfold here would be remembered long after the lights dimmed. The room itself seemed to mirror the divide between the two figures at its center. On one side, Hillary Clinton, former Secretary of State, presidential candidate, a figure who had lived at the peak of American political league. For decades, her reputation was built on years of navigating the hardest corridors of power, and to her supporters she represented strength, endurance, and a symbol of the political establishment's resilience. To her critics, however, she symbolized something different. The very embodiment of entrenched politics, of alliances forged in shadows and decisions that left lasting scars both abroad and at home. Standing across that divide was Tulsi Gabbard, a congresswoman from Hawaii, younger, less established in the hierarchy, yet carrying with her the weight of lived experience that was not drawn from political dynasties or years in Washington backrooms. Tulsi's story was different. It came from the battlegrounds of war, from first-hand service in uniform, from a perspective shaped not by theory, but by practice. She was a soldier, a major in the Army National Guard, who had seen war not from the polished halls of Washington, but from the ground where its consequences were most painfully real. Tulsi's approach to politics reflected that grounding. She spoke not in rehearsed lines, polished by consultants, but in the steady tone of someone who had lived the outcomes of political decisions. Her focus on issues like foreign policy, endless wars, and the human cost of intervention set her apart. She was not there to climb a ladder, simply for ambition. She was there because she believed her country was drifting further away from accountability and truth. That contrast Clinton as the figure of experience and establishment, Gabbard as the soldier turned politician speaking with unvarnished clarity, was what drew so many eyes to the unfolding dynamic for Clinton. The stakes were about maintaining the narrative, holding on to the authority of experience, projecting control. In a space that she had dominated for years, for Gabbard, the stakes were something different: authenticity. The chance to speak truth in rooms that often dismissed it, the ability to embody a kind of leadership that came not from entitlement, but from service. As conversations buzzed through the hall, people leaned toward one another to speculate, to compare, to wonder what would happen if the two worlds collided more directly. Some whispered that Clinton saw Gabbard as a threat, not because of her immediate political power, but because of her authenticity, because she carried a credibility that was harder to disarm with polished speeches or rehearsed lines. Others argued that Gabbard's challenge was less about Clinton herself and more about the entire system. Clinton represented both views, carried weight, and in the quiet exchanges that rippled across the room, the unease became more visible. To understand this tension fully, it's important to step back and consider the broader landscape. Hillary Clinton had long been a fixture in American politics, shaping policy, weathering storms, and building an image that was both admired and deeply criticized. Her run for the presidency in 2016 had marked not just a campaign, but a cultural flashpoint. She represented to many a ceiling yet to be broken, a vision of progress, and yet her loss to Donald Trump had also left deep fractures within her party. And among her supporters, Tulsi Gabbard entered politics from a very different path. She volunteered for military service after the September 11th attacks, leaving comfort behind to serve her country in war. That choice, deeply personal and deeply consequential, defined her worldview. She was shaped by the realities of deployment, by watching fellow soldiers face loss, and by understanding how the decisions made in Washington impacted lives far from the debate stage. When Tulsi spoke about war, it was not abstract, it was memory, it was lived. This authenticity resonated with people who felt politics had grown too distant, too insulated, too dismissive of ordinary experience in her. They saw someone unafraid to break from party lines, someone who challenged even her own colleagues when she believed they had lost sight of what mattered. This independence made her a lightning rod, celebrated by some as courage and criticized by others as disloyalty. In the context of Clinton's presence, that independence took on sharper meaning. Clinton had been at the heart of many of the foreign policy decisions Gabbard often critiqued. To question those choices, in the same space, even indirectly, was to poke at a legacy carefully built and fiercely defended. Clinton's allies often viewed Gabbard's criticisms as unfair, too simplistic, too dismissive of the complexities of global politics. Yet, Gabbard's supporters argued that those complexities had been used for too long as shields for poor decisions, for wars that dragged on without accountability. The stakes then were layered for Clinton. It was about protecting her, standing her narrative, her authority. For Gabbard, it was about speaking the truth of her experience, about not being silenced in rooms where silence was the currency of survival. In that ballroom, under the glow of chandeliers and the hum of conversation, the contrast between these two women became more than just personal. It became emblematic of a larger question facing the political world. What kind of leadership do we trust? Do we trust the seasoned figure who has weathered every storm, who knows the game and its rules intimately, or do we trust the soldier who steps into the arena with fewer alliances but deeper scars? Neither figure was simple, and neither story could be dismissed easily. Clinton carried the weight of history, of countless battles fought within and beyond her party. Gabbard carried the weight of service, of sacrifice, of a conviction that sometimes the greatest truth comes not from polished speeches, but from lived reality. As the evening unfolded, it became clear that this was not just about one moment, not just about a potential clash at a single event. It was about two approaches to politics, two visions of leadership and the people in that room. And beyond it, we're beginning to realize that whichever vision prevailed would shape far more than one night's headlines. The tension that had been quietly simmering finally began to reveal itself more openly. It did not arrive in a dramatic burst, not in shouting or sudden gestures, but in the way conversations shifted, the way a question lingered a little too long, the way certain glances carried more meaning than the words themselves. The first clash between Hillary Clinton and Tulsi Gabbard was not staged on a debate floor or in front of flashing cameras. It unfolded in quieter but equally telling exchanges that reflected the deeper currents running beneath the surface. The moment began with a comment almost casual, though everyone in the room knew it carried weight. Clinton's circle often leaned on her record, her experience, her years of navigating both foreign and domestic crises that evening. A remark was made about the importance of trusted leadership, of the need to rely on those who had proven themselves. In difficult times, it was not pointed at Gabbard directly, but the implication was clear. Experience equated to credibility, and youth or independence equated to risk. Gabbard standing nearby did not allow the implication to pass unnoticed. She responded calmly. I hear her tone. Even her words deliberate, she reminded the room that experience alone was not enough if it was built on choices that led to failure, if it meant defending wars that drained lives and resources without resolution. She spoke of soldiers who had returned home, broken of families who had carried the burden of decisions, made far away from the battlefield. Her words were not sharp in delivery, but they cut deeply because they were grounded in lived reality. The room shifted, conversations quieted, eyes turned, and suddenly the exchange between the two figures became the focus Clinton accustomed to. Challenges did not shy away. She reminded those listening that leadership required not just ideals, but the ability to navigate a dangerous world, to make compromises, to balance the impossible with the necessary. She spoke with the tone of someone who had lived through the complexity of global politics, of someone who believed that criticism was easy when one did not carry the responsibility of power. The first clash was not loud, but it was unmistakable. It revealed two competing visions, one rooted in the belief that the system required steady, experienced hands to keep it from breaking, and another rooted in the conviction that the system itself was broken and needed honesty more than expertise. The subtle conflict grew sharper when a direct question was raised. Someone asked about America's involvement overseas, about the wars that stretched on, year after year. Clinton, with her practiced authority, explained the necessity of maintaining global influence, of ensuring that America remained a leader in a world filled with uncertainty. She spoke of alliances, of responsibilities, of the dangers of retreating. Gabbard listened, her expression steady, and when Clinton finished, she stepped forward. Her reply was measured but firm. Leadership should not be about maintaining power for its own sake, she said, but about remembering the human cost behind every decision. She described, watching the faces of young soldiers as they prepared to deploy, seeing the quiet fear in their eyes, knowing many would. Did not come back the same. She told of families who lived with that fear every day, families who paid the price for choices made in polished halls. Like this one, the words carried weight because they were not crafted for effect. They were spoken from memory, from pain. In that moment, it was not a debate about strategy or abstract principles. It was a clash between two worldviews, one shaped by policy papers and political calculations, the other by war's unforgiving reality. The room seemed to hold its breath as the exchange played out. Clinton's supporters nodded, seeing in her the figure who had spent years holding the line, who had carried the burden of impossible decisions. Gabbard's words, however, drew others in, those who felt unseen by the establishment, those who had grown weary of endless wars and the explanations that came with them. It was not hostility that filled the space, but something deeper, recognition of a fracture that had long been present, a divide within the party, within the country, within the very idea of what leadership should look like. Clinton spoke again, reminding everyone of the fragility of global order, of the dangers of leaving power vacuums that adversaries would exploit. She framed herself as the protector, the one who had faced threats directly and understood what was at stake. Gabbard responded by challenging the assumption that America's role had to mean endless war. She questioned whether maintaining global dominance was worth the cost, whether it was worth the lives lost, the resources drained, the trust eroded. Her voice remained calm, but her words carried the force of lived conviction. What made the clash compelling was not simply the disagreement, but the way it represented larger forces at play. Clinton was the voice of continuity, of establishment politics, of a system that had functioned in a particular way for decades. Gabbard was the voice of disruption, of questioning, of demanding that the stories of soldiers and families be given as much weight as the calculations of diplomats. The tension escalated not through raised voices, but through the quiet certainty of each side. Neither woman yielded, and the audience felt the gravity of the moment. Some leaned toward Clinton's authority, others toward Gabbard's authenticity, but all recognized that something meaningful was unfolding. By the time the exchange quieted, the air had shifted. It was no longer just a gathering. It had become a stage for a deeper conflict, one that reached beyond the individuals themselves. It was about trust. about truth about the very soul of leadership in America. That first clash did not end with resolution. It ended with questions. Questions hanging heavy in the air. Questions that would not be answered easily. Could experience justify decisions that carried such heavy costs? Could authenticity alone guide a nation through the chaos of global politics? Could the two visions ever meet, or were they destined to remain in opposition? As the evening moved on, the audience carried those questions with them. The quiet tension remained not fully resolved, not fully spoken, but alive in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. The clash had begun, and though it had not broken into open conflict, it had drawn the lines more clearly than ever before. If the earlier clash revealed differences in vision, what came next revealed something deeper. Why those visions mattered, not just in theory, but in the lives of real people. For Tulsi Gabbard, politics was never only about speeches or headlines. It was about memory, about lived experience, about the faces she could not forget to understand her stance. One had to understand the story she carried with her, a story that could not be left at the doors of Washington. She often recalled the heat of the desert, the dust that clung to everything, the silence that came before nightfall, when the base quieted and soldiers tried to rest. Deployment had not been a headline for her, it had been her reality. She was not an observer of war, she was a participant. She had stood among those who shouldered rifles, who looked out at a landscape that seemed endless, who lived each day with the knowledge that danger could arrive without warning. It was there in the stillness of those nights that she learned the difference between rhetoric and truth. Rhetoric spoke of strategy, of missions of noble causes. Truth lived in the eyes of the young men and women. Beside her, eyes that betrayed fear, even when their mouths stayed silent. Truth showed itself in letters folded carefully into pockets. Letters written to parents, to spouses, to children. Words that might be the last ones ever sent for Tulsi. Those memories were not abstractions. They were anchors when she stood in political halls, when she spoke about the costs of war. She was not theorizing. She was remembering the sound of boots on gravel, the weight of helmets in unforgiving heat, the laughter shared in rare moments of calm. Laughter that carried the unspoken knowledge that tomorrow might change everything. One story in particular had stayed with her. A soldier young and full of determination had once sat across from her. During a rare quiet evening, he had spoken of home, of a mother who baked bread every Sunday, of a younger sister who had just started college. He had confessed his fear, not of dying, but of being forgotten, of becoming just another number in a war report. Tulsi had listened, offering the only comfort she could: presence, acknowledgement, the silent vow that she would remember him, no matter what happened. That soldier did not return home the day the news came. The base grew heavy with silence. No speeches could capture the weight of that loss. No policy paper could translate the hollow ache left in the hearts of those who knew him. For Tulsi, it was not a statistic. It was a name, a face, a voice that had once spoken of bread and home and fear of being forgotten. He had become one of many, but to her, he was singular, irreplaceable. This is why she spoke the way she did in those political exchanges. This is why her words carried a different kind of force. She was not appealing to theories or partisan points. She was speaking from a wound that never fully healed. Every debate about war and foreign policy, every clash with establishment figures was layered with that memory and countless others. Like it, the human story extended beyond soldiers themselves. It lived in the families who waited, who carried on with daily routines while their hearts never left the battlefield. She remembered meeting mothers who wore smiles for the world, but cried in private. She remembered fathers who tried to be strong, but could not hide the crack in their voices when they spoke of pride, mixed with dread. She remembered children who grew up too fast, who learned to count days by deployments instead of birthdays. When Tulsi spoke against wars that stretched endlessly, she spoke with those families in mind. She carried their stories into rooms where decisions were made. Rooms often too detached from the reality those decisions created. That detachment was what she opposed most fiercely. Not simply the wars themselves, but the ease with which they were prolonged by those who never bore their weight. In contrast, Hillary Clinton represented a different kind of story. Her experiences had also been shaped by global crises, but from another vantage point. She had sat in rooms with generals, diplomats, and heads of state. She had faced the responsibility of protecting a nation from threats most Americans never saw. Her story was about the weight of responsibility at the highest levels. The fear of leaving gaps that adversaries could exploit. Her memories were filled with moments where hesitation might have meant catastrophe. The clash between Clinton and Gabbard then was not simply about policy differences. It was about two sets of memories, two lived realities colliding. Clinton carried the story of a world stage where decisions had to be made under pressure, where mistakes could cost millions. Gabbard carried the story of the ground where those decisions translated into lives forever changed for the audience. Hearing Tulsi's personal recollections made the issue impossible to view as abstract. It was no longer about foreign policy or military strategy. It was about the soldier who feared being forgotten, about the mother who baked bread on Sundays, about the empty chair at a family's dinner table. It was about the difference between numbers in a report and names written on folded letters tucked into uniforms. The more she spoke, the more the room seemed to bend toward her story. Even those who disagreed with her positions could not dismiss the truth of her experience. They might argue about strategy, about global responsibilities, but they could not argue away the memory of a young man whose voice she still carried in that way. Her story became a bridge connecting policy to people, connecting abstract debates to tangible costs. As she finished recalling one of these memories, there was no applause, no dramatic reaction. There was only silence, the kind that comes when words settle into the heart. People shifted in their seats, not because they were restless, but because they were moved. And in that silence, the human weight of the issue revealed itself more clearly than any argument could. For Tulsi, sharing these stories was not strategy, it was necessity. It was the only way to remind those in power that behind every decision stood people who carried the burden, who bore the scars, who sometimes never returned. And for those listening, the lesson was undeniable. Leadership was not only about charts and policies, it was about memory, about conscience, about carrying stories that must not be forgotten. The tension had been building quietly, layer by layer, like storm clouds gathering in the distance. For a while, it seemed as though the debate could continue. Endlessly, arguments, traded perspectives, defended stories laid bare. But every discussion reaches a point when words stop circling and instead strike at the heart of the matter. That moment arrived suddenly, and when it did, the room seemed to hold its breath, Tulsi's voice steady yet charged with the mem. Ori of those personal stories turned toward the broader question. She asked not with anger, but with gravity, how many more lives must be lost before leaders begin?